Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast, Season 2, Episode 10. Today, I'm going to be talking to Paul Lebeau. Now, I've known Paul for a few years. I had the pleasure of interviewing him a few years back, and I really enjoyed getting to talk to Paul whenever I can. He's just a really fun person to know, and talking with him is always a pleasure. And we're always able to digress about all kinds of food topics around bread, and it's just really fun to know him and get to talk to him. Paul's a shareholder and the managing director of the German company Mockmill, run by Wolfgang Mock in Germany. Paul's mission in the grain and breads world began about 6 years ago when he joined Wolfgang Mock's decades-old campaign to get consumers milling their own grain. Milling your own grain was probably something that was kind of far-fetched a few years ago, but as we've all seen in the last year, there's been a huge resurgence of it, and people are very interested in grain and bread. Paul's accomplishments include the establishment of the Mockmill brand in baking circles around the globe, his educational promotion on whole food baking through participation at baking events, and his lively presence in the social media world are well known. Paul has been instrumental in the U.S. grain movement to get people using small-scale produced grain to do home milling to create bread and other foodstuffs. And Paul believes that home milling is more than just a practice, but something that is at the forefront of healthy lifestyle. You're going to hear from the conversation. We're going to digress on this more and talk about it. It's something I'm very passionate about. And as you've seen from prior interviews with people that I've talked to previously who have cookbooks on alternative grains or have, gluten-free bakeries, that alternative grains, ancient grains, and small-scale produced grains are very important right now, and a lot of people are looking into this. It's a really hot topic. It's something I really got to enjoy talking to Paul about, and I think you're going to detect that passion there. Paul's one of those guys that I feel like I could talk to all day, and luckily I get to talk to him often, so that's always a treat. So I think you'll pick that up in the interview. So I'm going to go right to it without further ado. Here we are. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. Today, I'm having the pleasure of talking with Paul Lebeau from Wolfgang Mock Company, Mockmill Company. Paul, thank you for being on the show.
Hey, it's great to be here, Dean. Greetings to North America and to California.
Oh yeah, it's you're in Germany, correct?
Right.
What city in Germany are you in?
We're in a very small place called Otzberg, which is hard to find except on Google Maps. But we're, for people who know Germany a little bit, we're just east of Darmstadt, which is an historically important place. And for those who just know the world according to its airports, we're not very far from the end of the runway at Frankfurt International Airport.
Now, you're from Houston, am I correct?
Right. I grew up in Houston. I was actually born in Central Illinois, a place I've really never returned to. But I grew up in Houston, and I lived in Houston and really only knew until I was about 18. The Houston area, a little bit of other parts of Texas and some of Louisiana.
Oh yeah, nice. So how did you come to work for Wolfgang Mock Company in Germany?
Well, that's a great question. You know, the long story is I met a girl and a woman actually, and began a relationship with her, and she was a tenant of Wolfgang at the farm that he and his wife had bought 20 years previously. And so over the years, I became a neighbor of Wolfgang's, and then a friend. And I was at that time still the kind of gray suit, black shoes, white shirt, red tie guy, who I'm not anymore. And he was very suspicious of people like that, which I can understand better today than I could back then. But at that time, I had just joined an Australian startup in the biotech field, and I was to be their man for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and to start this company up from nothing, and it eventually became a roaring success in industry that people know better today, for better and for worse, which is the in vitro diagnostic industry. It's where all these tests come from that we're using for COVID, and it's also the industry that Theranos tried to take by storm. So I was part of that industry, and Wolfgang watched me build this this business up very, very successfully here. And so when it came time for me to make a change, he said, "Why don't you change and come to me and help me build up my third startup in Homestone Mills?" And I looked at the business over a period of time, and I looked at the advantages that would have. I looked at the risk and the excitement of taking a completely different change professionally as you approach 60, and I decided to go for it.
Can you tell the listeners who are not familiar with the product what the Mockmill is and what the company produces?
Sure. The Mockmill is really what we feel the most modern, most advanced version of the oldest kitchen appliance of humankind. So if you go to a museum about the prehistoric age, you're bound to find evidence that people have been using 2 stones to break seeds since the very, very beginning of time. So it's probably the oldest kitchen appliance there is, and what we have is what we think is the most advanced version of that. That's not the point, because even with a less advanced version, you can really do a pretty good job of breaking seeds up and milling them down to flour. But that's what we have. So it's a very efficient, very neat, tidy, clean, simple, and affordable tool that's a real life changer, because we're able to go back to that old human tradition of collecting seeds and breaking them open when we want to use them for food.
It's funny because talking to you about this, I had talked to a couple of other authors just in the last month who have cookbooks about alternative grains and stuff. And the one thing that I hear the most is that I think there was some difficulty in them finding things that they could use to grind various things. And of course, there's, always, coffee grinders, which I think are highly inefficient for the task. So can you tell us about your work as a baker and how maybe this inspired your work with Mockmill and what Mockmills do?
Well, sure. When I joined Wolfgang, my first job was to kind of get the lay of the land, analyze the situation. Why does anybody want a tool like this? What's going to make people, what stories are going to make people want to buy it? What good is it going to do people? And as a beginner in the field, and in the field of really of food, I had to do a lot of exploration. So I spent 3 or 4 months just with my nose in the internet and making lots of phone calls, and actually made a big trip to the US to visit every leader in the grain revolution in the baking revolution I could get in touch with. But somewhere in those first months, I realized, well, if I'm going to get involved in this, I'm going to get passionate about it, and that passion is going to come also from the doing. I've got to start baking, and kind of fortunately, I was staying at the home of a cousin in mine in Evanston, Illinois, outside of Chicago, which happens to be right down the street from Hune Bakery, Ellen King's bakery there. And I wanted to thank my cousin, so I gave her a little Mockmill, a little attachment for the KitchenAid, which is all we had at the time. And she said, "Well, great, how am I going to use this?" And I said, "Well, just make your flour and bake it." "Well, how am I going to bake bread?" And I said, "Well, you really need to bake sourdough bread." And she said, "Well, how do you do that?" And I said, "Well, I'm not so sure." So we got out the laptop and we looked up Breadtopia's recipe for making 100%, making a sourdough bread with 100% freshly milled spelt. And we went down to Whole Foods and bought some spelt, and we went over to Ellen and connived her into giving us a bit of sourdough starter. And with the video, we sat down and began baking bread. So that's when I got back to Germany. Wolfgang was a bit surprised because he'd been after me to get my hands into the dough for some time, and I'd sort of been putting it off. So that's how I got started, and it really has become a passion. Just ask my family.
So I've read a lot of authors on bread and flour, and I'm sure you do as well. And what authors are you reading about bread and bread baking, or have you read?
Well, that's a great question because I started, devouring as many books as I could find on different subjects, and to be quite honest, I didn't start with bread or baking. I started with food and what, how do we feed ourselves and how ought we feed ourselves and what is the way forward to feeding ourselves better? Because I came to realize early in that investigation I was making that if one was going to really change the what we in business call the penetration rate, the percentage of the population that uses this tool that Wolfgang's had been designing and pushing for 35 years, one was going to have to find a problem that it solved. And so I became very, very interested in the problem of the food system. And the book that really put all the light bulbs on in my head was Dan Barber's book, The Third Plate. And so I always mention that. I think Dan has probably had the most influence on my thinking, because as I read this book, I said, that's it. We make this stuff that this guy is saying ought to happen, we make it more doable. And so that's really one of the biggest books I read early on. But then I met and read Maria Speck's book. She was one of the first people talking about heritage grains and whole grains. And it turned out she had 3 of Wolfgang's mills, and she's been milling since her youth in Germany. And she's a wonderful person. And then I met Ellen King. Her book came out later, but it's a great one. And the list is really, really long. And of late, I've gravitated towards the people who have picked up on the milling and said, wow, this has got to be included in our book if it's not going to be the central sort of part of our book. And so Ellen's was one of the first ones to say, here, the Mockmill is a great tool to have, and milling your own food is great. Adam Leonti wrote a book called Bread Lab, which talks about exactly that, so I found that book really to be great. I also like to read books that are composiums of different bakers coming together, and one interesting series is the Respectus Panis series, which I can thankfully read in French. It's also translated into English, but it remains very French, so it's nice to be able to read it in French. And there, again, we're talking about a better way of baking bread from a French point of view, and but speaking to an international audience. And I find those books really great. And then there's some other outstanding books. Martin Phillips' book. Martin is the head baker at King Arthur Flour, and a fellow I've been lucky enough to go elbow to elbow with in the baking lab at Peter Reinhardt's University, and that's the one baking book I've read cover to cover because it's such a great story, such a great and deeply moving personal story of somebody who gives up everything, gives up the high-end six-figure salary and the glass office looking over New York City, and goes out to live in a poorly insulated century-old cabin, basically, with his family in Vermont to become a baker, and bakes his way up to a leadership position at a company like King Arthur. Fantastic story. And these are the books that I love, and there's so many of them. Michael Calanti's book on books on baking bread and baking more bread. But many of these are personal stories. And I think every baker's got a story, because you only become a serious baker if if baking speaks to your soul, and when it does, you're ready to give up all of kinds of the traps of modern life that most of us are kind of caught in order to pursue that that really deep message that that comes to you when you plunge your hands in the dough. And so I love reading all those.
Well,
by the way, I got to mention the most recent books that have me excited are Vanessa Kimball's books on sourdough and how it heals the gut, and she is a great and adamant promoter of fresh milling and of taking advantage of owning a mill to include a plethora of ingredients in every loaf you bake to make sure you get the most wholesome possible bread. And so her work is, I think, really leading in the field these days.
Well, it's funny because I read a lot of cookbooks in the last couple of years, and I'm seeing this kind of like growing movement towards using like the non-big company grains and using like heritage grains and using different types of grains. And I mean, it's becoming like a really huge thing. And we're also looking at maybe not, you know, over farming, you know, with some of the big grain crops that we've been doing in the Midwest. And like, I have to wonder, like, it must be exciting to work for a company that's kind of contributing to this like revolution. It must be very exciting for your company to kind of be a part of this whole thing.
I think it's exciting, and I've been lucky in life because I've been in my old career. I was part of some really exciting things. I mean, I'll never forget the day in 1985 where the marketing manager came barreling out of his office at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon and said, "Lock the doors, nobody's going home. The FDA just approved the first AIDS test, and we've got to have it packaged up and ready to go on Monday morning." And we spent the whole weekend, called everybody who was available back into the office. We spent the whole weekend trying to figure out how we were going to avoid 1 hour's delay in making the world's blood supply safe again. That was incredibly exciting. I've been involved in, I was the first guy in the field to show pathologists and gynecologists a new way of preparing cells from a woman's womb to be used to detect early signs of a cancerous situation, to prevent a disease that in our mother's generation killed more women than anything else if they didn't die of an accident. And more recently, I made a big contribution in bringing to the world a better test for tuberculosis, which kills 2 million people a year. So I've had these really exciting adventures in starting off with something new where everybody doubts that it's of any value, and it turns out to be of great value. And so I'm not so so how can I say it? I'm not so in awe of being part of what's going on in the food revolution. But I do think it's bigger than any of those other things that I've been involved in. I think what Wolfgang Mock, what Mockmill is doing is a bigger contribution to humanity, even than getting that first AIDS test out was.
Yeah.
Because it touches everybody. What's going on is going to improve our lives in our lifetime. People are in the last third of life. If we get into this, we're going to have a better, that third of our life is going to be better. And it's going to help our kids, our little bitty kids who are learning not to just eat food out of plastic packages and already cut up, but to really get to learn about their own food and choose it carefully. That's going to make their lives better than ours have been. And I think that's huge. And we're all very proud to be a part of it. Our little German company is, I think, sometimes a little bit overwhelmed. You know, when we're getting orders from 90 countries around the world, and having to kind of remake ourselves as we go along. That's really pretty overwhelming, but it's a lot of fun. And we've got
Yeah.
a great bunch of people that are determined to make that contribution.
Well, there's a lot of fans out there of the product. When I read about it when I read the product reviews on Amazon, or I've looked at the comments on it, it's always so favorable, and the testimonials are incredible. You must have like a big culture surrounding the Mockmill. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, the culture is really Wolfgang's legacy, and Wolfgang Mock is a fascinating figure. He he's one of those guys who was born a year and a quarter after the World War II ended in Germany, and Germany was going to be in kind of famine state for another 5 years. The Wirtschaftswunder kind of got going when he was about 7 or 8 or something like that, but his family situation was not favorable, and so he's always been very much his own person, and he's a highly gifted person. And so I don't know if you know many gifted people like that, but they often have a hard time figuring out that they are gifted and what they're going to do with those gifts. And so his story is really, really interesting. But the main point for us is that at 29, when he was just about to finish his university work to become a psychologist working on autism, somebody bought him this loaf of bread, and it changed his life. And he started to understand how we were using cereal grains, and that it was a total anomaly, and that the bread that he had gotten as a child in war-ravaged Germany was actually better than what he was able to get as a young man. And so he became passionate about this. He likes to laugh about how he basically alienated everybody he knew by his passion, and he warns me against that all the time. But that's his legacy is this company, and he's always been determined to find a way to build a better mill. And we talk a lot about how we could improve our mills, and we go through the iterations, and he's fabulously passionate about that.
Since the quarantine, there's been a huge resurgence in home baking, and a lot of people are doing the obligatory sourdough, of course, and they're making a lot of bread. I mean, I think the sales for bread making products, like anywhere from bread pans to different like cloches to put bread in, everything, even down to something like as simple as the razors we cut the score of the top with, they're flying off the shelves. I mean, you can't keep it in stock. Amazon's full of it. And like when I go to the store, in the section where flour is sold, alternative flours, you can't keep them on the shelf. I mean, all Bob's Red Mill products, just like it's on the shelf in a second and it's gone. How has all this influenced your company? Has there been a surprise in your company about this kind of rapid grassroots movement?
I think it's a kind of thing that I want to say hope for. Some people would say prayed for. And I actually kind of expected, but I didn't expect it to come thanks to a pandemic. I kind of, in a very, in Germany we say a blue-eyed way, it means a naive way, I thought that just all the hard work and the way this thing fits into what the great people in the different grain chains and the different parts of the grain revolution have been doing for decades, that this was just going to happen naturally. But as it turned out, COVID did give us a great big bump, but it didn't give us a kind of a rocket boost. It's not as, okay, now we're on our way to the moon.
Right.
I think it did convince us that we have a real life company, that we can build a brand, gain recognition, make a change in a significant number of people's lives every year, and keep doing our work. And I think that's what we're after. We're never going to get rich. We're not going to be able to roll this out to some company that pays us gazillions for it, and like you would in a high-tech situation. And all we want is to be able to keep doing our job and keep working at that ideal that Wolfgang set up. Hey, everybody ought to have one of these things. Everybody ought to be appreciating freshly milled whole grains, and everybody ought to be appreciating more and more different kinds of foods. And we just want to keep on telling that story. So I think that it would be a big exaggeration to say that Mockmills fly off the shelves. We still celebrate every order that comes in, whether it's a single consumer ordering something off our website or a new customer, a new distributor in some faraway country sending us an order for a pallet of Mockmills. And we still know that we depend on that growth to keep employing the good people we employ, and to someday be able to spend a little bit of money getting the message out there. Because today we just work as most small companies do with a minimal marketing budget and on social media, and we create all our own content, and we focus on keeping the people who invest in our company by buying our product, keeping them happy. Those are, that's what we do. So it hasn't been a huge boom, and all of a sudden we're now, we've got our feet up on the desk and we're enjoying it. I do know from people like our friends at Breadtopia that it's really hard to keep proofing baskets in stock.
Yes.
And companies like theirs have been really overwhelmed because they don't just have one product line to kind of crank up. They've got to figure out how to get these products from all over the world that they need and have enough of them and not have too many of them. And so it's a big challenge for that, what was a tiny little kind of cottage industry 10 years ago.
Why does the world need Mockmill? Why would you suggest it for people?
Well, I think the world needs Mockmill because we don't understand, we don't have a connection to the types of foods that deliver 40% or so of our calories. I mean, the energy that we get. Let me tell you what I mean by that. If we talk about juices or wine, everybody knows the fruit. You drink some wine. Wow, this is really good. It's really interesting. No. You know what grapes are. You could be munching some grapes while you drink some wine, right?
Right.
I'm sure that most of the tomatoes in the world that are sold in the world get sold processed as ketchup or as tomato sauce or something like that. But everybody knows what a tomato looks like.
Right.
Everybody can slice a tomato, bite into a tomato, enjoy fresh tomatoes, learn about different kinds of tomatoes and so forth and so on. But unless people get equipped with a stone mill, they can't really appreciate and get acquainted with cereal grains. And cereal grains, as you pointed out to me earlier today, they're just hugely important in terms of their contribution to our food basket. So Mockmill makes it possible for people to discover cereal grains. And I think that by itself is important, but what that discovery does is it leads to an interest. That means that people start to discover grains in a different way than they can discover grains by buying them processed. It isn't just the fact of looking at grains and feeling them and picking up a handful of grains, and considering the fact that in these 10,000 grains that are going into your loaf of bread, each one's a life that could be a mother plant and have lots of baby plants in a short time. Beyond that, you get to use the whole food. And that's the big difference, as my friend Christian Remessy of the French Research Institute for Agricultural Topics talks about. He says it's such a huge departure what we have today from what our ancestors did when they went around collecting seeds, breaking them up between two stones and soaking them to ferment them, and then later putting them in the fire. It's a huge downward spiral towards using only the energy carriers, only the endosperm of just a very, very few grains, and among those few grain types, using a very, very narrow variety of what is naturally an amazingly large and rich variety. So Mockmill opens up a lot of doors. It opens up the door of discovery to the individual, but I think it also opens up markets for the people who are going to the trouble to plant different grains. going to the trouble to plant grains for which there's not a commodity market. There's not a guaranteed, there's not a guarantee that somebody will buy what you need to get for those special grains when you grow them. You're taking a huge risk. And the funny thing is that what that farmer needs to get for those special grains from a consumer is not very much more than a consumer is ready to pay for just an extraction of a kind of bland commodity grain that isn't going to provide him anywhere near the nutrition, and certainly not the how can I say it, the richness of that distinctive grain that he can buy and now use. So it opens up markets for people who are ready to provide stuff. It then people say, oh, gee, what else can I mill? They start thinking beyond just wheat flour. My friend Charmel Allange at Selu, which is a great bakery in Washington, D.C., if you're ever out there, is the pastry chef there. And he said, when I got there, the new boss, we were just opening up, and my new boss, Jonathan, said to me, I want you to avoid using wheat whenever you can. You're going to need wheat for your laminated pastries, but otherwise pastry doesn't need wheat. It doesn't need gluten. You end up fighting the gluten when you're a pastry chef. It's one of the reasons you put so much fat into it to break to keep the gluten from dominating. He said, so use other things, please. And Charbel said, I said, what? How am I going to, I can't, be a pastry chef without pastry flour, And Jonathan said, well, let's just get you one of these little mills and get to work. There's a lot of things you can mill. And in the meantime, he says, it's fantastic. We use a lot of sorghum. We use a lot of buckwheat. We use millet. We bake cakes with rye. And we just avoid using wheat. And the story is there's nothing wrong with wheat, but there's something wrong with being so focused on it that you don't use any of the other great foods. Right. So people are baking bread and pastries and cookies and everything else using bean flour, which is a fantastic way to get your pulse intake, to get the great proteins and fibers that are in pulses. They're using bean flour to thicken their sauces, which is a great alternative to using white flour to make your roux, and the story goes on and on. So what Mockmill is contributing, we think, is to a really better food system, a food system in which distinctive foods are more available to consumers, and in which markets are more available to the people ready to sacrifice a lot of security to produce those distinctive foods.
Well, I think we were talking about that it's just not safe to have like all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, with wheat, for instance. Like if we're only just producing one type of wheat, we're in danger of like something like the Irish potato famine or something like that, where we could have issues with it. Also, we're depleting the soil by just doing wheat all in one area. We're destroying the soil and making dirt. We're making dirt we just have to pump chemicals into to grow the wheat the next year. So I think a lot of people are saying that if we start doing like more local grains and different types of grains, we could, reduce carbon emissions, I think.
Yeah, well, this is one of the big learnings I got from Dan Barber's book, From the Third Plate, was that, plants basically, they look for minerals and other elements that the earth contains, and they're really searching for the whole periodic table of the elements, if you like, when they put their roots down in the ground. And when we plant, and each one wants something different, but when we plant the same thing over and over again, we're letting it take everything it's looking for out of the soil, and then we replace just 3 elements. We replace NPK. Now that's an exaggeration, but really that's what we do. We replace nitrogen, we replace potassium, and we replace oh heavens, somebody should help me there. Whatever P is, phosphorus.
Yeah.
And everything else gets depleted to nothing.
Yeah.
And then all the the microflora that helps break down what animals leave behind and what plants leave behind in the soil have not got what they need to live. And so they die away, and you get this incredibly poor soil that you keep hearing about. And the answer Dan reveals really well in the book is proper crop rotation, where a lot of thought is given into given the climatic conditions this year, given what I expect and everything else, what am I going to plant behind this crop now? And that decision gets made in a very short term. And the more markets farmers can address, the more things they can plant. There may be something really great to plant in a field to bring the soil back around after it's, gone through a growth phase with a particular thing. But if there's no market for that, they're in a real quandary. And more often than not, while we're just looking at yield, how much, of those 4 big crops can we get out of these fields? And we're naive to think that we can keep doing that forever. So this is the story. And I think, and so reading Dan's book, I thought, well, wow, if everybody had one of these little tools and everybody started to get really interested in this, there would be those markets for more different kinds of foods that farmers could plant. And quite frankly, we'd be doing much better in terms of getting our organism and also our co-inhabitants of our organism what they need to thrive. And by that I mean the microbiome that populates our bodies, and for the most part our intestines, which needs to be properly fed. And we basically ignore it when we eat refined food. We ignore the needs of those co-inhabitants when we eat refined foods, because what they want is what we think is just ballast, is just roughage, is what it used to be called, is the fiber. Our bodies can't do much with the fiber. We just, we poop them out again. But that's what we think. But they not before they've fed the bacteria that does a good job of keeping our intestine, indeed our whole system, healthy. I like to say that eating refined foods is like a cavalry going off on a campaign and not bringing any horse feed along,
Right.
The soldiers may do all right in terms of getting fed, but if you don't feed the horses, you're going to be in big trouble. So that's kind of what we do when we eat refined foods.
Well, I think we talked recently about this, where one of the things I don't think people recognize when they buy flour is that they could be eating flour that the wheat was maybe grown a couple of years ago and it's been sitting somewhere, and it's maybe not, the freshest stuff in the world. And growing wheat myself a little bit, it's nice to see that when you grind something down and you make the flour from it, how fresh it is, and the taste and the flavor, whereas the stuff you might get in the store might taste like nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the freshness angle is a big one, and it's hard. It's not hard to try to communicate it, but it seems to be hard to get the message to really sit. But I like to ask this question: how many people still use powdered eggs? How many people still use powdered milk? Okay, how many people? What would you think if you walked into a grocery store and you went looking around and were confused and went in and said, I'd like to buy some tomatoes. And they said, well, come right over here. Here you can have canned tomatoes, you can have diced canned tomatoes, you can have tomato sauce, you can have tomato ketchup, you can have tomatoes soup, you can have everything you want from tomatoes right here in the tomato aisle, And you go, well, I would like tomatoes, right? And they go, well, why would you like tomatoes? And I go, well, because I'd like to choose between red tomatoes, yellow tomatoes, big tomatoes, pear-shaped tomatoes, plum-shaped tomatoes, ox heart tomatoes, vine tomatoes. I like to touch them and feel them and smell them and everything else. And they look at you as if you come from outer space. Well, that's the way we deal with grains in our society, because the store is full of stuff that's made with wheat, rice, and particularly corn, but there's nothing that looks like wheat or corn in there. And you can get something that looks a little bit like rice, of course, but gee, try to find, if you looked at everything that's in the grocery store, you'd find out that very, very little of it is in a state that's close to its natural state. And most people wouldn't really recognize soybeans or spelt grains or rye. People might recognize wheat, maybe. But most people just don't even grasp it. So imagine not knowing what a grape looks like. And if you take it to great extremes, you and I are about the same age. There's an old Charlton Heston film called Soylent Green, where people are just eating platelets. That's of course a bit exaggerated, but not all too exaggerated.
No, not too. I think there's some relevance there right now.
Yeah. So that's what we're doing is kind of working at preventing, making sure that situation, that terrible situation that film depicted, simply never happens. And we're encouraging people, and I do this, I think I probably do it about 18 hours a day, encourage people to go discover new ways to use whole foods, to use whole dry foods. That's our focus, to really enhance their diets, enhance the beauty of their offerings at the table, create for themselves take along snacks that keeps them from grabbing the really awful stuff that nobody ought to eat, that gets that gets passed under your nose when you walk through an airport. I bake a loaf of bread and cut the slices down to where there's only about a few millimeters left holding the loaf together, and I take that on a trip with me, and I can make a whole transatlantic trip and feed myself just on my bread. And I know that my body is thriving on that. There's almost everything in it needs, maybe an apple or something like that, some vitamin C for the day. And long term, I can't forget that it hasn't got as much vitamin B as I need, but it's got everything else. And that way I can avoid all of the sticky, tasty, sweet, highly refined, gooey, simply bad for me and certainly bad for my waistline, fast foods that get offered at every corner as I walk through the airport.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for being on the show. I've really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to you. I'd love to have you on here again, maybe as a panel with some other speakers as well.
I'd love to do that anytime, Dean, and I hope to meet you personally when I'm through San Francisco the next time. I think it's a great work you're doing. I enjoy your podcasts, and I know that the friends of mine who have also been your guests have also enjoyed it. So we want to encourage you to keep doing that, and really, really appreciate the focus that you've brought to creating a better food system.
If you ever come here, please do let me know. I'd love to hang out with you for the day. That'd be wonderful.
I certainly will. Thanks very much, Dean.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. I really enjoyed talking to Paul, and I think that showed through. He's somebody that I always like to get to talk to him, and when we get to talk, we talk for hours. So I hope you get to talk to him more, and I hope to get to have him on the show more often as well, because we could talk about this topic of home milling forever. Next this week on Science Week, we're going to have Abby Thiel, Abby the food scientist. You may know her by better, on Friday. She's going to be talking to us about her work in food science as a food blogger, and about her YouTube blog about food science. She's a wonderful person to talk to. I really enjoyed getting to talk to her as well, and like Paul, I could talk to her all day. She's just a font of information, and she's really good at kind of dispelling some of the myths about food and talking about the real bare bones science of food. She's just a brain and a half, and I just really love talking to her. So come and listen to that episode on Friday when we air it, and we'll see you then. Until then, keep cooking.